I think we can begin our second part. I was looking at the camera a little bit and I had myself kind of sideways, and I thought if you want to watch this, you'd probably appreciate the priest not being kind of sideways. You'll wonder if it's your computer screen or something and it's just all awkward, right? You'd never blame the priest. But sometimes you should. So we start today at the beginning of chapter 12. Chapter 11 had concluded with Agabus coming to Antioch with this prophecy about the coming famine. And there was a famine. It was widely known in the time of Claudius. And then they choose to send money to the church in Judea in the care of Barnabas and Saul. And then we kind of jump back to Judea. And there's some possibility in the book that it's playing a bit with timelines, that it seems to follow a group of people for a while, then jump backwards and narrate events that were happening before as well. And it's not really clear exactly when everything happened. In ancient history, they don't quite write things down in the same way that we do now. And excuse me. And I think it's important to remember that the calendar we use now is actually called the Gregorian calendar. And it was modified by one of the popes after the Middle Ages because the years had gotten far off from where the sun was, because they were using a Julian calendar before it was called, and it didn't have the extra quarter day at the end of the year, because Earth's year is it 365 and a quarter days, and so we have a leap year every 4 years, and that keeps us in tune with the sun. Well, the earlier calendar didn't have that, and so they got further and further off from where they were supposed to be. So I think they did it in October one year. There was a year where like the first day of October was October 1st, and the second day of October was October 15th. But it had gotten about 2 weeks off, and that's part of the reason why with the Orthodox, some years, Orthodox that don't follow the Gregorian calendar are several weeks later with things than we are. So it jumps back into the story of the church in Jerusalem, and it talks about the arrest and death of James by Herod. Now, which Herod is this? So the puzzle is that there are many Herods. And the one that rebuilt the temple, the one that is probably most widely known is Herod the Great. And he died about the time of Jesus' birth or a little bit after, but he probably wasn't the Herod that Luke was talking about. Then he has a son named Herod Antipas, and he could be the Herod of Luke. But he dies too, before the book of Acts. And so this Herod is probably Herod Agrippa the First. So it's very possible that biblically there's been 3 Herods, and they didn't tell you which one it was. But this is probably Herod Agrippa. None of them are very nice, but it's good to know which Herod we're talking about. So Herod starts arresting Christians in Jerusalem to appease the Jews. And it says that, and this is probably the same language that shows up in the Gospel of John, and should bother us a little bit, because many of the Jews were becoming Christians. Many of the ordinary people probably didn't have the antagonism against Christians that is widely noted in the Scriptures. The Jews used here is most likely indicative of the Jewish leadership. The Sadducees, the high Pharisees in Jerusalem, that kind of group that condemns Jesus. We talked about it in the Gospel of John as well, because he uses Jews rather widely when a more accurate description today would probably be Judeans or the Jewish leadership. This is probably the same thing. But he has this Herod, whoever it is, Herod Agrippa probably, has James arrested and killed. This is the James that was the brother of John, James that was part of the group of 3 that were closest to Jesus. He shares with Jesus in his death. He has him arrested and killed. And if you think about this in the context, this is the first of the apostles to die. He's the first one. He had been with his brother, and their mother came to Jesus and asked if they could sit at his right and his left. And Jesus says, "Can you drink the cup that I will drink? Can you be baptized with the baptism with which I am baptized?" And in this case, they say, "We can." And here, James dies. Now, there's a couple of things that are noteworthy about this. Well, there's lots of things, but the first one is that he's the first of the apostles. He dies as a martyr. He's choosing to live in a greater kingdom than this world. That eternal life is more important than life here. He submits to faithfulness to God first. And I think this is something that we have to take seriously, because we're living in a strange world where even 10 years ago, some of the things that we're dealing with now would have been hard to imagine, especially on this issue of transgender things. It's very, very rapidly becoming a state where disagreeing about transgender issues is leading to widespread persecution. As Christians too, when we talk about prophecy, there's this tendency to focus on prophecies about the end of the world. That has happened since the very dawn of Christianity. The book of Revelation, and people were reading it, and St. Paul talks about it, and several of the other apostles have early writings about the end of the world. And the basic answer that Christianity gives is, yeah, it's possible. The world could end. We could all get chased by giant alligators and eaten. Unlikely, but it could happen. You've never worried about alligators eating you. Even if you're in Florida, the alligators usually don't eat people. Crocodiles are grouchier than alligators. But as long as you leave them alone, they probably won't bother you. But we should live as if we might not have another day. We should be living as if this could be it. Because it could be for any number of reasons. Many of you know, or you've been going along in life just fine, and all of a sudden you have a heart attack, or you end up with some health crisis, or another thing happens, and you never know quite where life is going to lead. And this is the state of the apostles too. That they have to learn to live for the moment, not to leave things undone or unsaid. To seize the day. It's a good old Latin phrase, carpe diem. I think it comes from one of the emperors actually, but it's a good thing that working hard, of striving to do great things, of seizing the day and trying to conquer it is better than just letting days drift by, because you never quite know what the future is going to hold. It notes that Herod lays hands on the apostles, or in this case, James. And it's an interesting turn of the phrase, because where else does laying hands show up? In ordination. And Jesus, the Christians lay hands on people as a sign of blessing or prayer. Like, when Christians lay hands, it's a good thing. Now here it uses the same expression for Herod and the people who are arresting Christians, that they lay hands on Christians, and it's now being used for evil. There's this contrast that happens in the text between like Gentiles embracing Christianity and the Jewish leadership and these Jews in Jerusalem rejecting it. The things happen in the Gentile world, they pray together, the Holy Spirit comes. In this Jewish world, it's a lot darker. So Peter is arrested as well, and this is during Passover. Now, one of the things that occurred to me as I was sitting here is, why do you think only Peter was arrested? Because Peter is the leader. That's the first thing that comes to mind, because Peter is the leader of the church. But what are some other possibilities? He could have been the most outspoken. That's a good answer. What else?
Set an example.
He was, meant to be an example, that he was going to be attacked. But there's one possibility that I think points to our bias. Were the other apostles there? That actually, it may be that Peter was arrested because he was one of the only ones there. We have this sort of image in mind, in the back of our minds, that the apostles are sort of sitting around a table in Jerusalem, and they light candles and they pray a lot. But the book of Acts has shown us at several times that they're actually out on journeys, that they're visiting a number of churches. And so it's possible that Peter is arrested because he's the leader, but it's also possible that they wanted to arrest a bunch of them, and they just weren't there. That they could be out preaching in various places. And I think we have to be careful, because we have this image in our mind that is different than maybe the situation on the ground. Now, the text doesn't tell us. It could be just because he was an example or the leader. That's very possible. But there are times and indications that do point in the direction that they weren't all just sitting around and waiting, that they were out on journeys. So Peter's arrested during the Passover, like Jesus. This time, he's guarded by a huge group of soldiers. It's a bit of a contrast to last time, because Peter's been arrested more than once already, and what's happened before? God broke him out of prison. Arresting him doesn't work very well. They were told to stop preaching, and they're continuing to preach. So this time, it's not like he's arrested by a few people. He's arrested by a bunch of them, and they chain him between them. It notes that. But this, I think, is a beautiful spot to pray into as well. Because Peter is arrested, and when is he freed by the angel? In the middle of a night, and not just a night, but the night before his trial and his probable execution. And if you think about that, being arrested probably isn't on your list of things to do, especially arrested in this kind of situation. Even today, like if you get arrested in Iran and you're a political prisoner, you're arrested for your beliefs, they don't exactly treat you nicely. They're not known for that. It was the same thing here. And Peter's arrested, so what happens in the church? They pray. But not just that they pray, it's that they're like consumed by praying for Peter. They go crazy over praying. He was the leader, they're intensely praying, and they're praying probably for some length of time. And the situation likely feels desperate. Like, Jesus, what are we going to do without Peter? What are we going to do without the leader? How does this church thing work if they get rid of the guy that you appointed? And I think that it would be hard to imagine something like this unless you would suspect, for instance, that like there was one night where they came and arrested all the priests in Fargo and the bishop, and we were just all gone. And all of a sudden you show up for Mass and there's no priest, and there's no one around, and no one knows what happened. You know, that's probably somewhat akin to the situation. There's a kind of desperation. There's a kind of deep longing, probably sadness, probably sorrow, all kinds of things. Peter himself is probably praying quite fervently. You know, he knows that God has rescued him several times in the past, but he's left there until the night before his trial. And I think there's a beautiful example here of the importance of persevering in prayer. It looks like God isn't answering them. It looks like Peter is going to die. The situation looks gone and lost. And nothing is going to happen, that God is going to be silent. If you're in those kind of moments, that tends to cause a lot of anger. When you pray for something and the Lord doesn't seem to answer you or doesn't give you the answer that you want. Does Peter give up? Does he resign himself to martyrdom? I mean, he knows. The other example in the back of their minds is that James was just killed. Like, this isn't just being arrested. This is serious. This is something. They might just kill him. And in some ways, you could imagine Peter as caught in more than one kind of prison. That there's other prisons as well. The emotional weight of that kind of moment. It would reveal the value that you place on this life. It would reveal all kinds of things about where you were. And it's easy to talk about Christianity and talk about following Jesus when you're preaching and doing miracles. And now when you're arrested, it ain't so easy. And there's lots of us that have prayed through moments like this. There's lots of us that have been in this place where we're crying out to God in sadness and in pain and in loss. And it's not an easy thing. The people probably know that the trial is coming, that this is all coming to a head. And so if you see the scene with the kind of tension that it involves, it makes way more sense why the scriptures describe it the way they do. Because an angel of the Lord appears, he tells Peter, like, get up, arise. It's that old language of the resurrection, and be clothed, cover yourself with a cloak, and come and follow me. But if Peter has been praying fervently for days and days and days, it makes way more sense why he would not understand it being real right away. That it had been something that he was longing for so much that he had been worn out mentally and emotionally and just kind of collapsed, that it could be a dream. So the angel awakens Peter and chains fall off him. It's a moment of grace, and God can change things rather quickly if he wants to. There's strong language here. Peter is raised up like it's from the dead, and they go out. The angel leads Peter out. They go past doors that are locked, that none of that seems to matter. This has a lot of echoes of the Exodus. Like the night before the people leave is the time of the Passover when the sons of the Egyptians die. We don't know when the Lord will come or when the day of our visitation is. We have to be ready for that. God will come like a thief in the night. Sometimes it's to die in this world and to enter into new life. Sometimes it's to a new plan. We're meant to be clothed in faith, in hope, in strength, in confidence, in the sacraments, in grace. That we have to be ready for the journey because we know kind of like in the story of the prophecy of Agabus, we know that the Lord is coming at some point, and we don't know when that day is. And it could be for the whole world, and it could be for us. Peter is then led out of the darkness into the light. He passes out the gates of the barracks or the jail or wherever he was being held and goes into the city, and then the angel departs. And Peter realizes, I'm actually not in prison anymore. There is this strong contrast between Gentiles and Jews here. We talked about the inclusion of the Gentiles in the church. In Antioch, they're embracing it in large number. And here, the Jewish leadership is plotting to put Peter to death. In the story of Jesus, he accuses them of being willing to violate the commandments. That you're willing to put me to death, but you're unwilling, to eat with unwashed hands. Like your priorities are in the wrong spot. Here too, the Jewish people are they want to put Peter to death. And they're not nearly so concerned about religious practice. It's quite a revelation.
I have a question. Going back to James and his beheading, I understood they're still under Roman rule, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Didn't they have to get permission to kill him like they did with Jesus? I mean, the time frame.
So did they have to get permission to kill James like they did with Jesus? Part of it might be yes, and we want to say yes because we live in a society that has the rule of law. But it's very possible that they didn't get permission. Any idea why?
No.
Oh, come on. Think of Russia. Technically, you're not supposed to murder people, right? It's against the law, even in Russia. Does it seem to bother some of the Russians in charge? No. Why can they get away with it? Because of corruption. They just pay people off. The Romans really don't care about these dumb apostle people. Like, in the Roman world, they're not very important. They're not raising an army. They're not trying to overthrow Rome, so they're not our problem. They're not committing crimes against Rome. They're committing crimes against the Jews, the Jewish faith, or at least that's what the leadership claims. So it's possible that they do ask for permission and get it. It's possible that, they just decide the Romans won't miss one, Jewish man or two. We can just get rid of them. It's also possible that they just kill him and either don't tell the Romans or pay off the Roman official. I mean, there was a lot of corruption at work in the society that we're talking about, and it's been a perennial problem. It's not easy to root out. It's become much easier to find corruption now than it used to be because there's records and there's audits and there's video cameras and all of those things. There aren't video cameras in ancient Rome, so they aren't going to get caught because they're also in charge. They don't play by the same rules that everyone else does. So I think some of those are possible. There might be other reasons as well. Peter finally realizes what happens, and it notes that he heads down an alley. I think it actually says that in the text of the scriptures. Yeah, they emerged and made their way down an alley, and suddenly the angel left him. Why do you think that detail is important? It tells us something. I think we're going to have to start a mystery novel book club. You guys have to pay attention to details. Why is an alley important? He's not out in the main roads. That he's kind of afraid, or at least acting intelligently. He doesn't want to be found. So he goes into an alley. even now, there's a bunch of street lights often on the streets, but if you go into an alley, it can be quite dark. That's one of the reasons why things tend to happen there. So Peter realizes what happens, and he heads to the house of Mary, the mother of John Mark. And they're praying there too. They're praying fervently. They've probably been desperate. So he goes and he knocks on the door, because they probably had a courtyard with a door or a gate in it. So he's knocking on the door, and this slave girl comes, named Rhoda, and she recognizes Peter's voice. And then what does she do? Does it say she actually shuts the door? She was so overjoyed when she recognized Peter's voice that instead of opening the gate, so it sounds like she doesn't even really let him in. She recognizes his voice, and she's so excited and caught up in herself that she runs to tell everyone else that Peter is there, that their prayers have been answered. And the people don't believe her.
Did you say she was a slave?
She is a slave, yes.
So is it the Jews that are having slaves?
Yes, Jews have slaves. So do Christians. This is one of the things that in the modern world we struggle a lot with. There is a strong history of Christianity with slavery, and it doesn't make it quite right. But it's more of a social position in the Roman world than something that's it's not quite like slavery here in the United States was. It's not just that you're left out and a second-class citizen. They don't have as many rights. But this was the ancient world, and at this time, something like 30% of the population could have been slaves. So it was something that widely happened in Christianity, and early Christianity doesn't seem to care a lot about it. Why do you think that is?
Well, if they were well taken, if they weren't abused, then it's a different, if they lived in the household or were provided for, it's a different kind of situation than if somebody's being treated like poorly.
Right. So it's a different situation than if someone is being treated poorly. That's part of it. But there's a bigger thing in the background. Christianity doesn't care a lot about it at the beginning because slavery doesn't matter in the long run. Christianity isn't about social standing in this world. The beauty of Christianity, one of the impacts of the message, is that slaves can go to heaven just like everyone else. That there's an equality of faith in the Lord. And so St. Paul will tell slaves to be faithful to their masters, and he'll also tell masters not to abuse their slaves. Like, that is a part of it. But slavery was seen as having no impact on salvation. That it doesn't matter. That you can be saved no matter who you are. That Jesus came for you, and for me, and for the apostles, and for everyone else. And so Christianity doesn't argue against it right away. It's not until much later that Christians really start to militate against slavery. And it comes from a reflection on the nature of our dignity. That if Jesus died to set someone free from sin, why should one person own another one? And it isn't the same, but there is a bit of an uneasy history with it. And you can see it even in the way that translators approach the text. They consistently take the Greek word for slave, that's very, very clear in Greek, and they translate it as servant. Now, part of that is probably because it was a little bit more like a servant, But look at the literary tradition. You can find, like in the story of Les Mis, I forget what the name, is it Cosette? Is a servant, and her life isn't all that pretty. Or the story of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, right? Her life isn't all that great being a servant. So there's something that, again, I think we have to recognize our position in the modern world. There's a good sense that sociology and psychology and some of those modern subjects try to help us look at the place where we are, because it impacts how we see the text. And in this case, it's becoming a stumbling block because the translators are even trying to fix the text and make it more palatable for us because of the position that we're in. Instead of talking about the text and talking about the implications of it and working on the education piece. It's not to say that this makes slavery right or to make a moral argument for slavery. I'm not trying to do that at all. But the sort of modern day revulsion against the idea is really, really tragic, because there's all kinds of assumptions that go into it that we often don't question. And this happens a lot in the modern world with all kinds of things. But if you see the scene and the desperation of the church, I think it makes way more sense why Rhoda does what she does. It is almost comical. Peter's trying to hide. He's convinced that the Romans might come out and get him because at any moment they're going to wake up and realize he isn't there. And they're going to start searching for him. And so he's banging on the door, probably wants to be quiet and not be seen, probably whispering. And Rhoda hears him, recognizes him, and goes to tell everyone else. And then they don't believe her. It's a little bit like the women at the tomb, right? They go to find the body of Jesus. He's not there. The stone is rolled back. An angel is sitting on top of the stone, says he's risen from the dead. So the women go to tell the men, and the men don't believe them. They go themselves, and they still don't believe. This has happened many times in history. She's accused of being out of her mind, but she's actually accurate. Peter's standing there. But then, it's funny, because if she's accurate, then the story is even funnier. Because if Peter is really there, then it's like, well, why didn't you bring him in? And eventually, after they're happy and celebrating and drinking the champagne, someone's like, we should probably go get Peter. Peter, again, you have to see how much stretching is happening here. This is not Jesus being nice to Peter. Because Peter had been stuck in prison and praying and probably desperate, and God didn't save him.